Dr. Majid was born in Morocco. He currently heads the Moroccan campus of the University of New England. In his spare time, he's the Vice President of Global Affairs at the university and the Director of the Center for Global Humanities at the university. He is the author of 5 critically acclaimed books that cover the topic of Islam, the West, and history. I could talk for quite some length about his accomplishments and his background. But from the looks I see around me, I think what you would like me to do is hand the microphone to him and get off the stage, which I will now do. Dr. Anouar Majid.
Just jotted the name of the MIT Dean, Christine Ortiz. She's in the news lately. You know, the big announcement and the big news in higher education the last few days, maybe the last week or so, is that she's leaving her post at MIT to start a new college, an interesting college in Boston, I think, in that area. And we don't know exactly what kind of college it will be. It probably won't have the same accoutrements you find in MIT, maybe long empty spaces, and it's a combination of technology and human beings, maybe sort of, you know, home to the new brand of cyborgs that will be populating that campus. But it's interesting, I'm thinking about higher education because the topic today we're dealing with has something to do with Islam and the West, and I can't remember quite the title I gave Bill, but I think I have an idea. Anyway, I was thinking of the MIT dean who started a new college, and it got me, you know, because I was thinking about MIT, and I am in front of this impressive group of alums who have been very active in all kinds of very interesting things in the United States, having a big impact on the shape and destiny of the United States, particularly in areas of engineering and, you know, aerospace, and like I was talking today, and a lot of other things. MIT plays a huge, disproportionate role in contributing to the American and global economy by the sheer, the output of its inventions and so on. And I think, you know, but we need some help from MIT engineers in some ways, because what we're talking about today is something that's been perplexing me for most of my intellectual life, which is basically how, just like objects come into existence, cameras and cars and planes and so on, how do religions come into existence? It is something that that a lot of people take for granted. I mean, people talk about religion. There are all kinds of talks about religions. You know, millions, tens of millions of books on the subject. People take religion for granted, like the air or the sun or the oceans or space. But the question still needs to be posed: is where do religions come from? There are 2 ways, as I said. I mean, I have to say them. I got to mention this only because just to give you some basis from which to start this discussion. And 2 ways of looking at this is either, you know, God, you know, speaks to someone privately, and that someone tells about usually his, it's not hers, but his relationship, his encounter and conversation with God to somebody else, to a wife or a friend, and then that person spreads the word about that. And we are all supposed to believe that that's exactly what happened, and that's how faith is born. You believe in somebody else's version of what God told them, because people, I say all the time, people never meet God individually. Somebody else meets God, and we hear. It's a process of hearsay. The other thing, which the historian or the cultural critic or the anthropologist or any social scientist would be looking at, is how religions appear as cultural phenomena in the world and society, how they develop over long periods of time, you know, but through a process of invention, borrowing, editing, refining until eventually, a religion is consolidated and begins to acquire characteristics of its own, and then we started calling it names like Christianity or Judaism or Islam. So today, I would like to say the reason why, if we understood this, if we understood the process of how religions come into existence, we will understand a lot about what's going on now in relation, especially in the case of Islam in the West and so on, but also go beyond the headlines that usually give us a tidbit of information, just give us enough to provoke our curiosity, but far from enough to help us understand exactly what we are dealing with. That's why speaking to a group like this one, or a group of scientists in general, helps us at least to go to the bottom of the thing and try to sift through the confusions that arise from not having enough information on the subject. The one thing to understand about Islam, it is that Islam is a religion of the book. And in other words, and this is something I used to tell my students in my undergraduate students, and I asked them if they believed in God, they would say yes. Well, most of them would say yes, we believe in God. And I would say, well, how do you know God exists? Because they usually end up saying, it's in the Bible. So it's not, again, to go back, it's through a script that we know of the existence of a certain religion. Religion is to answer the question, to begin to answer the question, is a script, is a text. And that's why it's called scripture. It is a script. People know religion through a book, through some kind of text. Without those texts, it's very hard to understand what is this notion of God, or what is this notion of Jesus or the prophets and so on. I say this because all three religions, the monotheistic religions, like the Judaism, for example, the first time they started writing the Bible was about 6th century BC, and then it was telling stories that had happened centuries and centuries before, and they imagining them. But we know for a fact that a lot of the basis of, let's say, three monotheistic religions, let's say, take the case of Abraham. Abraham is a pure invention of the Old Testament, of the Torah. It had no existence before. There is no historical evidence of his existence, nor of the existence of Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Hagar, and all the great characters that have shaped, that feature very prominently, especially in Genesis, but in the entire biblical history. It's a very, funny story. God all of a sudden chooses a man. It's in Genesis, a 65-year-old man, and chooses him to be the father of a new nation, not for any particular reason. And he's 75. His wife Sarah is about 65, and then they travel around Canaan and end up in Egypt. She marries the Pharaoh. Big long story. Then eventually he gets a concubine, Hagar. They produce a child together who is Ishmael. And then, of course, God to compensate them for their faith. Now Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is about 90, and now gives them a biological son, Isaac. And then, of course, and then of course, out of Isaac, there's a whole line of prophets. But eventually Sarah dies. He marries another woman. Abraham has 6 more sons. I don't know whether you know this. And then until he dies at the age of 175. The story of Abraham, we call people, when the three religions try to get together, they talk about the Abrahamic faith, the legacy, because Jews, Christians, and Muslims have the same. What unites them is the figure of Abraham. So eventually this notion of Abraham chosen for no apparent reason in Genesis, and later on in Jewish history begins to assume new roles and identities. He becomes an iconoclast. He is against human-made gods, and he becomes the emblem of the purity of faith. And it's that kind of legacy that stayed with him. Eventually, with the arrival of Christianity, he would be definitely, elevated to a figure of faith, because now Christianity goes against the Jewish notion of acts and deeds, emphasizes faith and dogma over acts and deeds. And of course, the figure of Isaac is transmuted into the image of Jesus, another sacrificial lamb, who has more universal proportions. And then, all of a sudden, as these religions were negotiating these images inherited from a script developed in the 6th or 5th century BC in Palestine or Jerusalem, they, out of this matrix, the Muslim religion begins to emerge in the 7th and the 8th centuries, and borrowing the same motifs that they found in existing Jewish and Christian ideologies. This in itself is a very vast topic, but I'll try to just give you little glimpses at this so we can at least have something to work with. And so they decide over time that Abraham actually, which has never been recorded in any other document, actually paid a visit to Mecca. I mean, there was no proof. The Christians never mentioned his presence in that part of the world, nor did the Jews. But he comes to Mecca, and then, of course, establishes what's now called the Kaaba. I mean, the Kaaba in Islamic mythology was established first by Adam, and then eventually Abraham came to rebuild it. And when Hagar was cast out by Sarah because and she took a son with her, Ishmael, they end up in Mecca. And then they didn't have water, so by a miraculous act, a well erupts called Zimzim. Now it's a very famous place, sacred place to visit, and all the circumambulations you see now, all the events that take place in the Mecca pilgrimage that happens every year depend on this narrative, a proof of which has never existed. So cranes are falling on people, killing hundreds. Stampedes are killing a lot of people in those pilgrimages. People are sacrificing their lives and their properties to be part of those pilgrimages, based on a notion that has no historical accuracy. So the figure of Abraham divides actually more than it unites the three faiths, because all the three faiths treat the figure of Abraham separately and differently from the other ones. And I think when you think, so the idea of Abrahamic legacy indicates to us that Islam is part and parcel of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's number one. I mean, you cannot think of Islam as separate from the Judeo-Christian tradition. It comes from the exact same matrix. The Quran, for example, is divided into two halves. The part of it which was revealed to the Prophet in the city of Mecca, and the one that was revealed to him after he became a prophet and migrated to a city now known as Medina. In the first part of the Quran, the part known as made up of Meccan verses, I mean, you're practically reading a Jewish document. It is there's nothing against the Jews in it. It is the grand figures of it. Muhammad is coming to propagate and fulfill the messages of Abraham and Moses. Moses is the grand hero, by the way, of the Quran, mentioned far more times than Muhammad is. And so, then something happens at some point in the Quran, what's called the Medinian verses. Then Muslims begin to fight with the Jews, according to the narrative. And eventually, in the beginning, Muslims turned to pray. They turned toward Jerusalem. Then they had a spat and they started turning towards Mecca. The idea of fasting was borrowed from the Jews. The ablutions too, even cleansing yourself with the earth if you don't find enough water is an idea that you can find in the Talmud. Even knowing when to fast, when to stop fasting is when you can separate the white threads from the black ones, which is something Muslims always say as one of the emblems of their faith, is something borrowed from Judaism. The closer you look at the Quran, the more you find that you're actually reading a revised version of aspects of Judaism. There are also Christian influences. But that Christianity was divided in the Middle East. There were so many sects. There were Nestorians, there were Monophysites, there were the Nazarenes. And so the Quran borrowed, you can find a lot of interested references to the Christians, but not to the official church in Byzantium, but to other sects that were fighting among themselves trying to define the nature of Jesus. So, number one, if we go back to Genesis, we'll find that a mythological figure that appeared in the 6th century, and the first time he appears in history is in Genesis, becomes the uniting and dividing element among the faiths that eventually appeared, and all saw him as the founding figure of those religions. Then when you begin to look at Christian history, for example, what you begin to find is, especially the critical moment, and someday when I have time in my spare time, is when Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century. Emperor Constantine, the first time a Roman emperor would convert to what had been until then a tiny little sect within the Roman Empire. Without they made a lot of noise, the Christians, but they were not really any dominant force in the empire. So why he converted is still somewhat of a mystery. But he converts. It's like President of the United States decides to convert to Mormonism or to some. We had a candidate in Mormon, but to some small religion that is not politically not a good political move. But he was an emperor; he could do it. And so he did it, converted to Christianity, and then decides to bring together the squabbling factions of Christians to Nicaea near Izmir in Turkey today, and have them in an ecumenical council decide on the nature of Christ. Because people have been fighting over the nature of Christ. And then that's how they came out with the Nicene Creed, the Trinity, so to speak, God and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and they are all part of that same godly divine spirit, separating, so that caused a tremendous division within the church that lasted all the way to the birth of Islam. So in Chalcedon, in what's now Turkey, the main church kept upholding this doctrine, and of course, with tremendous repercussions on people who didn't believe in this doctrine. They were damned as heretics or condemned as heretics, and so pagans also were persecuted. But in the fringes of those empires, which is Palestine and Syria, southern Iraq, maybe in Egypt and parts of Yemen, they were like churches that had been. They believed in another version of Jesus. They were divided among themselves about this nature of Jesus, which had never really died. It is out of this context that Islam comes out, denying that Jesus had ever been crucified. Because in the Islamic version of Jesus, Jesus is not crucified. He was lifted out, and somebody who resembles Jesus is the one who is crucified. And that you can find echoes of this in all these churches that populated the Middle East. That it's not the official version, but it's some Christian sects believed in this version of things. So you could see a lot of borrowing from the Christian tradition. And even sometimes you're not so sure whether Mohammed, because it's an adjective which means the praised one, is in beginnings of Islam, is a reference to an actual person who lived by that, who has that kind of name, which is an interesting name to have, the praised one, or a somewhat ambiguous reference to Jesus himself. We find, there's, as I said, the history of Islam has not been fully written yet. Far from it. They have very good histories, but they live in the shadows. Historians are working on some very good stuff, but they never make it into the mainstream. What the idea of Muhammad as a historical figure is not documented, historically. We know Muhammad only from writings that appeared more than a century later, or maybe at least 150 years after his death, after his presumed death. You know that the last gospel, when people were writing the New Testament, was written almost a century later, the Gospel of John, which eventually was a huge departure from the earlier ones, Matthew and Luke and others. But in this case, what we find is, we know that a man, Muslims know that a man known as Muhammad, who was a prophet, lived, but the only proof of his existence is the biographies written, as I said, 150 years after the fact and later. When you go and look at the historical evidence in the 7th century, he was supposed to have lived from 570 to 632 AD, we do not find a trace of him. I mean, it's almost, I always like to compare the event, it's like 100 years from now, you try to study 9/11, and there will be no mention of Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. It's that kind of, think of it that way. I mean, the Byzantine Empire had a long culture, which is part of the Roman civilization. Persia had a long culture of writing and history making and all that. The Greeks as well. Not a single mention. What's even more puzzling, there is not a symbol throughout the 7th century, for 50 years after his death, more or less, before and after. There's no mention, you can't find. The chroniclers who are reporting on these people, they don't mention the word Arab. Nor do they mention, absolutely not, the word Muslim. 50 years or so after the death of the prophet. If we're in Palestine, they know as Saracens, or there's Tayyeye, in the Syriac language, or there's another expression called Mariye, I don't know how to pronounce them very well. Hagarenes, we don't know, maybe in reference to Hagar. But no one is describing these people who are coming. There are reports, sporadic reports of people attacking Jerusalem, bishops writing, complaining about the hordes of Arabs, or what seem to us as Arabs now. But the name of Arab was not mentioned. Saracens, Hagarenes, somebody else. Definitely not the word Muslim. So what we see here is that in the 8th century, 7th century AD, we see a people emerging, a culture emerging, borrowing from Jewish and Christian traditions, and we don't know exactly who they were, what they wanted, and what they came from. The first actually proof of some text that indicates that has some resonance in the Quran is the one that surrounds the Dome of the Rock, which is about 691, founded by an Umayyad, a Syrian king, let's put it this way, a Syrian king by the name of Abdul Malik. It was during this age of Abdul Malik, 685 and later, that we begin to see changes in the government, in his government. First, he's the first one, and until then, they were still using Greek in administrative protocols and documents. He was the first one who mandated the use of Arabic in official documents. We begin to see coins that say Allahu Akbar and Muhammad Rasul and so on. Until then, there was no. Until then, there were coins, we had that had crosses in them, issued by supposedly a Muslim government with a cross. So there was a moment of gestation, and so on. The Quran was revised then. We have officials in Iraq saying that some official, including this Caliph Abdul Malik, saying that he is responsible for putting together the Quran, even though the Quran is believed to have been put together way before in the 7th century under the Caliph Uthman. So, and the name of Muhammad until then hasn't appeared. Now, this man was in Syria, writing, and his court was in Damascus. And all of this literature is emerging. He's decreeing all this stuff and claiming descent from the Arab people in what's now called Mecca and the Hijaz and that area. But he was not saying it from Mecca. He's saying it from Damascus. And after the dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus falls, the people who take over, they're called the Abbasids. And they didn't waste any time in building the city that has been consuming public attention ever since Baghdad. And they come from a very rich area, and that's the ancient site of Babylonia to the south. The Euphrates and the Tigris rivers are sources of great wealth, heavily influenced by the Persian civilization. And that's where the next dynasty of Islam emerges. And everybody who's writing those books, so people started writing, in that period of time, they decide, one of the caliphs, well, not one of the caliphs, actually there was widespread agreement on this. Now the culture, this new movement that's emerging, these people needed to prove themselves among other nations. So they decided to start a movement of translation. And they started sponsoring the translation of Greek works, into Arabic. Aristotle was a huge figure in this process of translation, but they translated Hippocrates, scientists, Euclid, you name them. All the great scientists and artists and philosophers of ancient Greece were translated into Arabic, first into Syriac, by the way, by Christians. Syriac is a branch of, or a dialect of Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, and then eventually into Arabic. It was at that time that nowadays when you hear a lot of fundamentalists or Salafis talk about Islam, they refer to that age as the golden age, of Islam, and that it's true. There was a massive amount of translation going on, and everybody was involved: Christians, Jews, Muslims, pagans, even those who still existed on the fringes, Manichaeans. It was still in flux. There was soirees and salons, people discussing, debating issues of faith and philosophy. Aristotle was mostly translated to help people make more powerful arguments against their rivals and opponents, because they relied on his logic. So Aristotle is a very interesting figure in Islamic thought, but it's another subject. So and this process lasted till the late 10th century, to the 900s, late 900s. When the second half of the 900s was under the Buyid regime, was absolutely the golden age. Was the flowering of Islamic civilization, people debating, translation movements, people happily borrowing other people's traditions. And occasionally you'd find a scholar, a Muslim or non-Muslim, a Christian, paying tribute to the heretical pagans of ancient Greece. These people who gave us all we know about civilization, who had lived, centuries, maybe a millennium before. It is the constant struggle. Those 2 centuries in Islam, 9th and 10th century, in Baghdad, not in Mecca. Nothing is happening in Mecca. Now, we begin with Damascus, now we move to Baghdad, the recently created Baghdad. Nothing is happening. So during those 2 centuries, that's when a caliph came to a guy called Ibn Ishaq, and I said, I'd like you to write a biography of the Prophet. Now, this is 750 AD. Prophet died 632 AD. And so the guy obliged, and he wrote a long biography, which eventually some people find problematic, and took some from it. The next one to do so was a guy called Ibn Hisham, and took some from it and discarded the rest as too controversial. The image, you could still see in those early days, Muhammad appears as a politician, a warrior, marrying women, doing that. He doesn't have that aura of prophecy that has come to be associated with him over time. And then, of course, that biography is gone. It's no longer extant. We know it from fragments that survived in other people's works, but that's gone. So over time, people keep writing more biographies about the Prophet. All of this writing is happening mostly in Baghdad. Nowadays, people think of Saudi Arabia as the seat of Islam. I say Baghdad is the seat of Islam. Always. Islam was created, in my view, in Baghdad. So and then that's how the image of the Prophet begins to emerge in history. And then his birthdays, his wives, his struggles, his wars with these people, the Jews, and so on and so forth. And then, but outside of that, outside of this literature, there is no other historical record or proof of his existence or of what kind of person he was. We don't find them in non-Islamic sources. The Byzantines, the Greeks, the Persians, nothing. There's an occasional reference to a warrior maybe, but it's extremely uncertain. There's no archaeological record, there's no numismatic record, which is the study of coins, and there's nothing to indicate that this person, as we know him, existed as such. What people do, the greatest biography written, I think, in the last 100 years in Germany, is what people do, they take a close look at the Quran. And if you take a close look at the Quran, it does seem to be, you can find traces of something happening in real history. There was a poor person, was orphaned very early. He was influenced by his family. Maybe there was some, members, maybe a priest or a rabbi or something. Eventually starts preaching against decadence and the oppression of the ruling class, and the impoverished begin to follow him. And then people wanted his death. He escapes to Medina, and that's when he begins to establish a nation. It's kind of a little bit reminiscent, and that's just occurring to me right now. Something like ISIS or something. You begin to create a nation out of the ashes, out of fragments, out of the debris of a broken society or an outcast, a group of outcast people against the established regime, which was based apparently in Mecca, in Quraysh. And then wars ensue. Many wars ensue that Muhammad leads them, and sometimes he deceives the enemy, sometimes he wins, sometimes he doesn't, and so on, until eventually he conquers Mecca and proclaims Islam the religion of the region, and then everybody surrenders to him and adopts Islam. When he dies, according to these records, not in the Quran now, the people who had adopted or embraced Islam, renege on their promise and go back to their pagan ways, and that's when the new caliph wages war against them to bring as apostates and to bring them back into the faith or to get them killed. But that's it. We don't know anything else. But so the proposition I'm making here today, and which is not clear in a lot of commentators' minds, is that, in my view, Islam is a cultural product that emerged out of a combination created by a group of people who decided to take from the Christian and Jewish traditions and eventually create a religion of their own and call it Islam. And give it a name, give it its proper language. In the Quran says, there's several passages, the verse in the Quran, in which God speaks is saying, and I revealed the Quran in Arabic, so you could have a book of your own. Well, I was once in Turkey, in Istanbul, and I speaking to a group of postdoctoral scholars, and I told them I was speaking about this, and I said, well, isn't that interesting, that God is telling Muslims that I revealed this Quran in Arabic purposely so you could have a religion of your own. And so it seems to me like, this is kind of a affirmation of an ethnic identity, isn't it? So, well, and then their response was, well, what kind of language do you want God to speak? They didn't get the point. I said, wait a second. The Quran also, like the image, it's interesting. The Quran is the equivalent of Jesus in the Christian faith. In the Christian faith. Because just like Jesus is inseparable from God, he's divine or inseparable from God, the Quran is also inseparable from God. The Quran is co-eternal with God. In other words, early on, some philosophers tried to argue that the Quran was created in time. That God existed first, and eventually, one day, he creates the Quran. That was condemned as heresy. And so, the prevailing notion in the Islamic faith is that the Quran was co-created, it always existed along with God. Is the Word of God co-eternal with God. Just like Jesus is part of the divine body. They're inseparable. That being the case, how does one contest the Quran? How can one say, okay, I don't like this verse in the Quran, I don't like this provision here, how do I? So interpretation has its limits. All of this happened again, not in the text of the Quran, not in the moment in history that people tell us it happened, but later on, in the 9th century and after. And that's what I'm saying, we need to start thinking about Islam, take away the notion, move away from the prevailing notion that God spoke to 3 different men across time and history, although they shared more or less the same geographical area, and each one of them told us what God told them, and then how religions were created, and we are supposed to absolutely respect them from now on. We're not expected to apply critical thinking to them. We're not expected to apply the same tools we apply to other historical events, or textual events, or anything of that sort. I think we need to start talking about these parts of religion, this part of Islamic history, and to begin to invite people into another way of looking at the ways at their faiths. Let's put it this way. Now, the question is, why did Muslim societies, and why did Europe eventually take off in a different direction, Christian Europe, and the Muslims stayed in a different place, still governed by theology. There's still no separation of powers in Islamic lands. Islam is still the religion of the state in practically all the constitutions. I'm not so sure 100% about the Tunisian one, but I'm sure it's there too, something of that effect. It is in the Iraqi constitution and the Afghani and all other states. Islam is the official religion of the state. Meanwhile, in Europe, in what used to be Christian Europe, now known as the West, no such thing exists. There's a separation of religion from the secular powers of government. And that's when, this is part of the reason why there are conflicts and clashes, especially when we hear about refugees having problems in in Western Europe or Muslims doing bad things. There is a genuine cultural clash going on. I mean, to some extent, I mean, you may not like Samuel Huntington, but he had a point in writing about the clash of civilizations. I mean, even though that seems to be, I'm just pointing randomly, I don't know, because I know I'm assuming that Samuel Huntington is not always well liked in liberal circles. So, why did they take off in different directions? Well, it's a long story, but basically because Roman civilization, the successor to ancient Greece, they kept the Greek curriculum in place. And to be a civilized Roman, you had to be trained and learned in the Greek traditions and the rhetoric and all the Greek arts. And so there's and then Christianity itself is a complex, it's a somewhat pagan, somewhat suffused with Greek ideas and Roman ideas as well. It's more of a Christianity as it later developed in Europe. It's closer to the Greco-Roman model than the Middle Eastern one. And then, of course, you have eventually the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the Greek works, which sometimes can be exaggerated. And then, but especially, the Renaissance, by the way, was to some extent enabled by the works of a Muslim philosopher, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who lived in Andalus in the 1200s. But eventually, with the rise of science, the discovery of new continents, the expansion of trade, brought Europeans face to face with cultures they had never imagined existed. You know, the natives, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So they began to question. You could see that in the works of Voltaire and others during the French Enlightenment. People began to question their own inherited beliefs as they're the only ones who existed. And so, combined with the rise of scientific thought and Cartesian thought in France, for example, and other places, and then philosophies of the Enlightenment in Europe, people's attitude towards religion began to change. But meanwhile, in the Islamic world, theology remained supreme. It's a theocracy because of this notion that the Quran is the ultimate legislation. It's a godly legislation. It's divine. It's of divine origin. It's eternal. Cannot be contested. Even though free thinkers in the Islamic tradition either were persecuted, very few survived and died of old age, but most people had to conform to religious dictates. And they still struggle, the struggle hasn't ended yet. I mean, that situation is still ongoing today. If you look beyond, the trappings of modernity, and I just read today in the paper, you probably did too, Qatar now is created a new government with a minister of happiness and one of tolerance. Have you seen that? So but all of these interesting things that are happening, there's no research and development in the Arab and Islamic world. Nothing. If you look at the scientific literature on the patents that are produced worldwide, you find an insignificant, negligible number from that part of the world, the Arab and Islamic world. There's no contribution. I just wrote a piece recently. You would never go to any mall you like. Go to the Mall of America in Minnesota. You would not find a product that's manufactured in the Islamic world. You can't buy a car manufactured. You can't buy a motorcycle. You can't buy a plane. You can't buy anything. You can only buy traditional products like, carpets and henna and things that people like to decorate their houses with. But there is no industry. Agriculturally, most countries are semi-arid to arid. So that's why they kept the lunar calendar, which is completely impractical. I don't know what good is it for. The lunar calendar. So people, every year in the Islamic world, people celebrate the birthday of the Prophet at a different time of year. So people don't know, we don't know exactly, again, one of those situations because there was no agriculture in those parts of the world. So the keeping of the seasons or making sure you're, sometimes you have two kinds of calendars, like in Morocco, for example. But in most cases, it's a calendar that doesn't make, it's not practical for business or for agriculture. So this is a challenge facing American and the United States and Western societies as a whole, and facing human civilization. The Muslim population will soon reach 2 billion people, so which would be a significant portion of the global population, maybe a third, maybe 40%, maybe 25%, or maybe a quarter, I don't know, something in that neighborhood. That's huge. If you add the Chinese to that and the Indians, you will, this part of this hemisphere will be overwhelmed. So we need to have, what I think for we need those civilizations, like with the Chinese and the Indians, to understand that the values of the Enlightenment, which first were given political substance by the United States, that they are good for other peoples as well, for other nations and other traditions. But you'd find China doing something very different from the Muslims. They pursue industrialization with a vengeance, and they have been very successful at doing that. And so they have adopted, in that sense, they had no compunction using Western methods, borrowing from the West or even stealing from the West. But at least they have been successful in industrializing their societies and creating wealth. Not so in the Arab and Islamic world, because research requires, and development require a certain amount of freedom, a certain kind of infrastructure, a willingness to take risks. And the risk factor is also huge. And I think what you see sometimes in those displays of violent terrorism and others is because it's a manifestation of the lack of freedom in their home societies. This has been going on for centuries. The architecture of the Islamic world is an expression of that. From the outside, you see nothing but just walls. If you go inside, you can see the courtyards and the beauty. In the facade, there are no public plazas. It's a Roman idea to have a public plaza for discussion. The Medina is just a labyrinth of alleys that lead nowhere. And so you find it in architecture, in urban design, in clothing. The veil also, by the way, is a Christian idea, but survived in Islamic societies. An obsession with purity and authenticity, and so on and so forth. These are the challenges that are facing, and all of these ideas have been woven together by a band of scholars, religious scholars and otherwise legal scholars, between the 9th century AD and, let's say, the 11th and the 12th centuries AD. In all the legal texts, the canonical texts that talk about the biographies of the Prophet, the legal reasonings that they published, all attributed to the Prophet and the Quran, all of those things. It's a collective creation of scholarship, which people have been unable to liberate themselves from. That's why I'm saying we need, it's social engineering at its best. I mean, that lasted for hundreds of years. I mean, it's still happening today in the United States. When I first came to the United States, and I used to laughingly or jokingly tell people, I got the impression that Jesus Christ was born in Virginia. The passion with which these pastors spoke. I'd be watching television and I said, my gosh, maybe Jesus is American, you know? You quickly forget that Jesus was born in Nazareth, in a place in the Middle East, and he was like a Middle Easterner, and he probably looked like one of those people like you don't like to look at on television. But it's the passion, and so I said, and my question then was, well, how does an identity like that migrate? Isn't that a wonderful sociological dilemma to see somebody in the middle of Iowa speak as if you were sitting, as you were the birthplace of Jesus. I mean, how do these people, identities travel, are inherited, they migrate, and they become so entrenched that you forget that they were borrowed from a place that you probably don't know very much about. And if you do, you probably don't like much. And what I'm saying now is true, because in the 19th century, the Cancun of Americans was the Holy Land. In the 19th century, after the American Revolution unleashed these missionary movements, and people, the place to go was the Holy Land. And everybody read the Bible and the biblical geography in Sunday schools. I mean, everybody's dream was to go to the Holy Land. Mark Twain went, but Mark Twain's account is Innocents Abroad is fascinating. But a lot of other people did too. And they came back disillusioned. They found a dusty place. It was dirty. They didn't find any of that land of milk and honey. The British thought the land of milk and honey actually was England, you know. So it was, they were disappointed. Somebody, you know, they were disappointed in the geography or in what they found in those places, which is fascinating. If you read the accounts of 19th century travelers to the Holy Land and compare what Israel did to that place right now, they have turned a desert, dusty, a place almost in ruins into the powerhouse, and they turned the desert into now, agricultural lands. Basically, they have turned it into a land of milk and honey. But it wasn't so in the 19th century, according to the many accounts of people's visits to the Holy Land. So, I forgot what I was saying, but anyway, the thing I'm trying to say is this question is very important to global civilization. We need a form of engineering. We need to think very hard about how to re-engineer people's minds away from such archaic notions of identity and belief, and to bring them back and so that we can collectively begin to experience if we need a spiritual life. I don't know whether everybody needs a spiritual life. If we need some spiritual life or emotional meaning or emotional experience, to create new ways. And by the way, why not have if prophecy is your thing, why not have new prophets for the 21st century? We're always talking about innovation. Well, who's innovating in the area of prophecy? I mean, well, there is no, that's 19th century. Now we are 21st, and we need to have new ideas about these things. How do we believe nowadays in the midst of technology? As I said, I talked before about cyborgs. How do we begin to think of a spiritual or meaningful or emotional experience? Maybe we need a religion that's based about time, just to give us more time to read poetry and books instead of surfing the internet and browsing or texting. I don't know, but there must be some way to move beyond what these ancient traditions have given us. If we don't, I mean, Jews and Christians have moved on because for a lot of historical reasons, and Judaism has, from my experience anyway, has become it's more of an identity issue than a religious faith for a lot of people. A very good friend of mine here lives in Portland area, rabbi, not liberal, and I asked him point blank, and I said, "Do you believe in the God of the Bible?" He said no, but he believes in the Jewish people. So it's very interesting. I mean, an imam would never say anything like this. Impossible to say anything like this. You have to believe in God. Muhammad is real. If you say something about him, you're dead. Something bad will happen to you. So it's that real. It's that sacred. And I've always said, the Muslim mind, if we call it that, is trapped in the sacred. Everything. It's a line of taboos, concentric lines that surround the Arab and the Muslim mind. You cannot criticize the Quran. You cannot talk critically about the Prophet. You cannot talk critically about his companions, or about the age he lived in, about his family, and so on. And that keeps going. That translates into political systems. You cannot say something that's offensive to the established order. The other two things that happen in Islamic history you have to understand, which is why people are always puzzled why there's no democracy in these places. There is no such word or concept as democracy or a republic in Islamic political thought. Has never existed. This is a Greek notion of democracy. Is a Greek notion that emerged in a city-state or in a country of city-states, and so it made sense. And it was also a polytheistic society, so where many religions and gods coexisted. So the notion of democracy made sense. It makes sense that the notion would emerge in ancient Greece, and to some extent, survived in the West, in the Roman tradition before before things changed during the Roman Empire. But it's a Western idea. Well, Greece was not the West at that time, but nowadays it has become a Greek idea, since Greece has been totally assimilated into the Western canon, for better or worse. So it has become one. But there's no such thing in Islamic political thought. The only thing you see here is the caliphate, or the imamates, the imam, or the sultanate, and good government means at least the minimally allows you to practice your faith unhindered, Islam. So there is no notion of representation, of republicanism, of democracy. These are totally new concepts that came to the Islamic world from the West, and the West is frustrated that these nations cannot really adopt a meaningful democracy, and like happened in Spain or Germany or France and other places. That's because of the powerful force of Islam in those societies. Alexis de Tocqueville, after he visited the United States and was totally impressed by American democracy, said that this kind of model of this system cannot be applied in the Muslim world because of the Sharia, because the Quran acts as the legislation, and because the Quran is the uncorrupted word of God, it's nearly impossible to amend in a serious fashion. You can tweak it around the edges a little bit, but not totally amend it. So herein lies a dilemma. What used to be a movement that arose out of the judeo-Christian tradition, with influences from Byzantine culture, architectural influences, or culture from the Persian one, eventually coalesced into a religion called Islam, attributed to ancestors in Mecca, in the area of Mecca called the Arabs. The word Arab doesn't appear in the Quran either, by the way. It's Arab, which is what appears in the Quran is more of a like a reference to a Bedouin, the types of people who lived on those places, and it's it's in a derogatory kind of fashion, not like in a celebratory kind of way. And eventually, this religion gets solidified by a very active body of scholars who gave us canonical works on about how to do everything, how to behave, how to eat, how to get up, what to say here, what to say there, how to pray, what Mohammed was like, what he did, his travels, his wives, his lives, and so on, his wars. And so the Muslims now take all of that package as sacred, and they cannot somehow, it's very difficult for them to question it in any meaningful way. And so the West finds itself stuck in this situation. I mean, you can modernize all you want. You can build high skyscrapers, you can buy Airbuses and Boeings, you can buy ships, you can buy the Trump Plaza if you want. But if you don't change your mind, if you do not change that kind of thinking, Without R&D, you won't have proper medicine, you won't have technologies, you don't have an industry. You will rely on oil exports, and when those dry up, you are in trouble. Or when the prices plummet, like now, you are in trouble too. Agriculturally, they're in a very precarious state. Food security is rampant in the region. Only a kind of innovation in faith, in cultural production, a willingness to break from those stifling traditions would allow the West and the Muslim world to come closer together again, like they had tried to do in the ancient age of Greece. Because the ancient Greek authors, they acknowledged the contribution of the Egyptians. They borrowed everything, they said, from the Egyptians and the Phoenicians. And the alphabet is a Phoenician invention. But there was an age of borrowing and an age of sharing, and everybody taking pride in other people's cultural traditions. We may need to go back to those traditions as one of the ways we can handle this situation. But as exists now, the situation of the Arab and Muslim world is precarious. It's going to continue to give a lot of headaches to the West and people who think about life differently. And so the best thing we can do is not take military action. That should be the very, very last solution, is to have a robust cultural offensive to change, to propagate, books, films, histories about the Enlightenment, about scholars and philosophers, other people's languages and traditions. Get them out of that cultural monotony that has really been a liability to those nations, even as much as they want to become industrialized and prosperous and have a proper place among nations. Without this kind of cultural change, I don't see how things could change in the near future or even in the midterm. I'll stop here and see if you have any questions.
Questions for Dr. Majid?
And first I must remark that your students, I think, are very lucky.
Thank you.
But I feel that, I have a question, but let me preface it. I feel that what you've reviewed in religion is really very recent. I mean, you only went as far back as the composition of the Jewish Bible, the was what, 8,000 years?
Yes.
No,
That's true.
Yeah. Well, what I'm getting at is that people lived a long time before that, and they still live in places that have been isolated until just recently. I mean, holy smoke, you spoke of the divine right of kings. I mean, on a normal scale of time, that happened during lunch.
That's true. That's true.
It's just very
That is true.
recently, but people lived for a long time before that, and they formed religions. And why? The polytheists, the animists, whatever, in Papua New Guinea, they have their own religion, right? Well, I think that you glossed over some of the affairs that influenced the growth of Western thought in Europe. I mean, for example, I get this daily email thing. It's called dictionary.com, and they send me a word, and they give the philology of the word and everything, and they'll have a word in there that any student of Latin for one semester will recognize as a Latinate derivative. And when they have one, they always say, this came into English in about 1500. And why is that? because of the Dark Ages. Now, we really, very few people imagine what a sinkhole Europe was in the Dark Ages. And what broke the ice was a combination of warfare and disease, collapse. And I mean, Descartes himself was a professional soldier.
Yeah.
And I think that in a way, this could argue for carrying out the program you
That's right.
wish. Because if there's anything collapsing around us, it is this Middle Eastern territory.
That's right.
And maybe it is time then to persuade people, some people, that they should look at another way.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you.
In some ways, you're a little discouraging, and we all see the rapid evolution of Christianity in the United States in places like Iowa and so forth. Is there a glimmer of hope? I mean, you're not the only person from a Muslim background to live in the West. Do you see emerging rays of hope?
Among which communities?
The Islamic.
Oh.
Signs of evolution.
Oh.
Now you're really getting me discouraged.
No, there's we are the Muslim community, the Muslims, or people in Muslim majority nations, which is where most of the population is Muslim, or what's used to be called the Islamic world, are very much, in my opinion, trapped in the Islamic faith, in this culture that was woven for them in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries by scholars. So the margin of freedom they have within Islam, while staying within the context of Islam, is very small. So they can't do much within that window they have. They have to break away from it to expand their horizons and think differently about the world. They have the choice of keeping their faith, but not to bring it to every aspect of their life. And so that is the problem. It is the implacable hold of Islam, or as defined for them by scholars from the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and how people seem to be trapped and unable to move away from it. And it creates a tremendous amount of confusion. I have a magazine online. I wrote a piece recently. I was thinking about the refugee crisis, and I said, if you look back in the middle of the century, the 20th century, there was a very interesting literature coming out of the Arab world, and the main theme of it is the promising young man from a Muslim majority nation, or even not Muslim, like Senegal or from Sudan or from Morocco, who goes to Europe and ends up in a situation where they kill somebody, or they end up in prostitution, or they end up rebelling, doing something, because they bring with them a culture that clashes with the West, with Western values. And the preeminent and the classic in this genre, and I really invite you to read it all, it's called Season of Migration to the North. Season of Migration to the North. And by a name called Tayyib Saleh. He's a Sudanese writer, and it became the emblematic novel of an entire generation. What happens to a very talented young man who goes to study in England on a scholarship, and how he experiences life with women, and then what the troubles he gets into, and then comes back to Sudan. In my piece in the magazine, I call it the chronicle of a tragedy foretold. Nowadays, people are looking at refugees and wondering about this clash of cultures and values, but it's been there all along in the literature and the culture as a window into social mores and practices.
Well, I think we probably saw that clash in Cologne in Germany, the attitudes toward women.
Yes.
That's something that's big.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I mentioned to you before, interesting Moroccan woman who apparently tried to promote feminism. I've never heard of her until she died. But that wasn't my real question. It's, you going back historically, you say that we don't really have evidence of Muhammad having lived or having been a person. But how do we know that the split between Shia and Sunni occurred on his death? You know, trying to determine his succession, because that has gone on.
That's right.
And that's pretty important.
Yeah, there was splits. Again, there were differences in a community, but whether those differences in a community prove the existence of somebody or not, that's a different story. I mean, again, I mean, we have no record of that existence except for accounts that are written later. And so everything you know about the Shia and the Sunnis, the split that happened not too long after the Prophet's death, is based on an account that came to us a century or more later. We don't know exactly what happened in that specific period in time and why those splits happened. I mean, the Shia as a whole, they've been an interesting group, actually. They have been, generally speaking, more open-minded about cultural influences and philosophy and other things than the Sunnis. But it's the same idea. I mean, even though the split is real, based on theological differences, which are themselves based on legitimacy of power and the imamah and who's the right owner of power after Muhammad. But all of those are accounts not given to us directly from that period, but from later sources. And so we are back to the same situation.
Yeah, that was a very nice talk.
Thank you.
I had a couple of questions. One, you mentioned this division in the Quran between the Mecca verses and the Medina verses. And I wonder, could you say some more about that? And are the roots of something like ISIS built into this ancient?
Yeah.
The other question is that I don't think we're quite fair to like the Turks and the Persians. We weren't quite fair to Turkey and Iran because both are fairly industrialized.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's a fair bit of secularism in both.
Okay.
How do they fit into the picture?
Okay. The first question. The Quran, the history of the composition of the Quran and how it was put together is a subject that requires a long time to discuss. But all we know, the Quran is supposed to be a revelation, a direct revelation, or through the mediation of the Archangel Gabriel to Muhammad. And at some point, in the process, people collected that information. Muhammad himself never did. And eventually was put together and so on and so forth. So eventually, when the Quran was put together, it was divided in two chapters and in two halves. One, the part that was composed when Muhammad was still in his early stages of his mission, the prophecy, and the other one is when he went to Medina and eventually he formed a state, which is called the Medinian verses. In the first half of those Meccan verses, it's more universal. It was more universalist, sorry, and he is speaking to everybody. It's not ethnic. It's not legislative. There's not a legislative document. It's talking about let's follow the Abraham of Moses and Abraham of Abraham and Moses. Let's he asked people to follow in the footsteps of other prophets and believe in them. There was no indication that a state had been formed with legislation and laws to dictate every aspect of social and human life, like inheritance issues, like how many women to marry, like what to wear, and all that stuff. So all of this stuff happens in the Medinian phase. You could see it clearly in the Quran. You could see, if you read the text, you could see now here we got from a wandering preacher to a man of state, or to a head of state. And you could see that difference in the text of the Quran. So that's a difference between the Meccan verses and the Medinian ones, in the way that has been defined to us by the powers that be. But if you assume that the Quran was written like that, it's authentic and all that stuff. The other thing is true about Turkey and Iran are very interesting cases. I think Turkey, the best thing that happened to Turkey is Kemal. You may not agree with me. Is Kemal Atatürk, who actually got rid of the Ottoman caliphs and established a modern nation, a secular modern nation. And it was for the longest time an autocratic secular nation, protected and guarded by a very military, until the rise of the Islamist Party, of the Party of Justice and Development, although now headed by Erdogan in Turkey, and slowly Islam is bringing back some of that Islamic tradition back to Turkey. I just saw recently they're building a massive mosque in Istanbul. Have you seen that? It's a huge mosque. It's like with huge towers and so on and so forth. This is the legacy of Erdogan. It's true. I mean, Turkey got to this point because of the incredible revolution unleashed by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And that's a difference between Turkey, a non-Arab nation, with the Arab and Islamic world. As far as Iran is concerned, I think it's more or less in a different situation. I mean, during the age of the Shah, there were attempts to modernize Iran and so on, but the massive human rights violations, sometimes even, condoned or they were sort of not condemned, let's say, by the U.S. administration. And the United States played a huge role. But anyway, that's the history of Iran is a different place. Yeah, they do manufacture cars. They have industries. They have scientists. They do much better than other nations in Iran. But by and large, you still are in the same situation where if you want to buy a car here in Falmouth, you won't buy an Iranian car. You won't find it in the dealership, or a Turkish car. They do. Iran does produce cars, and so does Malaysia. But it's not a huge industry. It's not enough to keep them going. I mean, these nations, especially Iran, less so than Turkey. Turkey doesn't depend on oil. Still has big chunks of its economy that are based on traditional forms of production and stuff like that. I wish it could be better. I was in support of the Iran deal, by the way. So I think a relationship with Iran is much better than Saudi Arabia.
Would it be fair to say that fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Judaism, and fundamentalist Islam have one thing in common, and that is the rejection of modernity, of the modern life?
Yeah, you know what? I think, they have one. The question is it fair to say that fundamentalist Christianity and fundamentalist Judaism and fundamentalist Islam share one thing in common, and that is their rejection of modernity? Modernity. Yeah. Okay. Let's even take this question and play with it a little bit. But to be a Christian, not a fundamentalist Christian, just to be a Christian, is to be in some sense a fundamentalist. Or to be a Jew is to be in some sense a fundamentalist. Nowadays people say, no, we should work with moderate Muslims. Right? You hear that expression, moderate Muslims, moderate Islam. Well, what is a moderate Islam? A Muslim still believes in the God and the Prophet and the angels and the companions and the prayers and the almsgiving and the fasting and this and that. All Muslims believe that. Now, maybe the difference between a moderate Muslim is moderate Muslim doesn't throw bombs at people, doesn't behead people. And the ISIS types or the Al-Qaeda types do that. But they share a common belief. It's especially with the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, it's no difference. So to have a religion to have a religion is by definition to be, to some extent, a fundamentalist. To say, because that's what shapes you as your identity as a person. You cannot, otherwise you'd have no identity. If it's like, identity is a tricky thing. I always say that. It's like, I am me because I'm not you, and you're you because you're not me. But we define ourselves by excluding somebody else. You know, I'm a Christian because I'm not a Jew. I'm a Jew because I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Buddhist because I'm not that. I'm American because I'm not Canadian. It's definite identity is always based on an act of exclusion. To have an identity. So how do we create an identity that does not really exclude? I mean, there are ways to think about this, but even more importantly, the question to ask is, why do we need ideas from antiquity to live well in the modern age? We don't do that in medicine, not in MIT, in the engineering schools, not in aviation, not in the way you build roads, not in the way you light your rooms and watch your but when it comes to identity, we hold on to ancient ideas as if they were eternal and incontrovertible. I don't know what to do about that. I think it's a problem that the engineers of MIT need to solve.
We're all in trouble.
No, that's it.
Many thanks, Dr. Majid,
Thank you.
for coming today to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you so much.
He's leaving for Morocco.